Hi, in this video I'll be going over the basics of the rules for War Room, a Larry Harris game published by Nightingale Games. And there'll be another video that covers more advanced topics, and there's also another video that goes into detail on combat. So check the description for links to those videos. This is the Eastern Front scenario, which is the two-player. It's the Soviets versus the Germans. There's three other scenarios besides this one. There's the Pacific three-player, the 4 or 5-player European scenario, and the global game, which can go anywhere from 2 to 6, maybe even 7 players. In the back of the book, there's covers what territories are included for each scenario. In this scenario, to make it even, these territories are not in use. France, Norway, and Denmark. So I put these embattled tokens on them to remind that they cannot be entered. You can see each area is tinted according to the color of the nation. So Germany has these gray regions and the Soviets have these brown regions. You see there's an info bar for each territory. The number on the left in the black box is the ID, so R8 in Kazakh, and G8 in the Baltic states. There's also codes for the sea regions, A, Atlantic, A3, and so that's the first box. The second box is called the strategic value, and this is the amount of stress you gain when you lose that territory. And stress is the driving force of the game, which if you accumulate enough of, you'll start to enter these penalty zones on this central wheel here called the stress wheel or homeland status chart. And you'll incur increasingly harsh penalties, which drives the end of the game. But the true objective of the game is to capture the enemy capital. And that differs per scenario, but in this scenario, Germany must capture Moscow, while the Soviets must capture Greater Germany, or even if they leave it embattled. Let's go over the next feature. You'll see there's some colored boxes after the strategic value, and those are resources. We have oil, which is red, iron, which is blue, and yellow, which is OSR, or other strategic resources. And these resources are used phase 7 to purchase new units. Some don't have any resources or even a strategic value, some of the minor islands. You'll also see a network of rails, especially in this European region, that allows for land units to do swift movement. We'll get into that. And some of these have industry sites. This is where new units can be placed. So I've set up the game for this particular scenario. To do that, each nation will take their supply of commands and their pegboard. This is the pegboard to keep track of the 3 resources, and this is their supply of commands. There's land, air, and naval commands. And then in here are extra territory cards and national flags, which are used to mark captured territories. So you'll have these territory cards. Soviets start with this, and they're slotted into their card holder. When an enemy captures the territory, you give them the card. They then gain the resources during the resource income phase. So if you look at the reverse side of the card, it shows the setup information down at the bottom here. The 26th starts with 2 armor, 2 artillery, and 2 infantry, and then the 11th, which are the air units, start with 2 fighters and a bomber. And it tells you where it is, R1 in Moscow. So you can set up the units that way. Also, you can look at the commands themselves. They tell for double checking and letting Germany check to make sure the Soviets set up correctly. You can see it's the 26th in region R1, and these are the units that belong in the stack. You have some armor units, some infantry, and some artillery. And the air units, which are round, you can see that they also have a little code to tell you what goes in that starting command. That's only for starting. Once the game begins, you can have any units as long as you don't break the limit of 8 units per command stack. You can have any number of stacks within a region of any type. Obviously, naval stacks can't go on land. Land stacks can go in the sea. They're assumed to have entered what's called a troop transport. So they're in transport boats sailing, but they're very vulnerable and they don't participate in combat. Once you've set up the board, according to the scenario, you will begin play. The first phase is income, and this is where you'll be counting up the different resources according to your cards. It's also shown on the map, but it's for reference. It's handy to refer to your cards. And then you track up using these pegboards. For example, if you were at 0, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You count up all your resources. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 oil. And you do that for each resource type. But the first game, you can see there's these little black triangle markers here, and that's just for reference, so you don't have to count on the first turn. The Germans over here, they also have the black, but the black's for the global, and this little one is for the Eastern Front for them. The Soviets always start with the same amount of resources for all scenarios. You'll tally up the resources and adjust your marker in the first phase of play, direct national economy. If this won't happen on the first round, but on subsequent rounds, you may have enemies in some of your territories, in which case you flip it to the reverse side and you receive reduced income as long as there is an enemy present there. So be sure to double check. Then after that it's phase 2, and this is strategic planning. This is where you would, in a larger game, be having discussions with your other allies and making secret plans. Oftentimes, this is the longest phase of the game because of those discussions, so we recommend using a timer to limit that to, say, 10 minutes. So during these discussions, you'll be also writing your orders down in this O&P chart, Operations and Production chart, secretly and simultaneously. All nations write down their secret movement orders, and then at the end of the phase they'll be revealed. So let's say I'm the Soviet Union and I want to make my orders. You can give up to 9 orders, and you give an order to an individual command stack, so a land command, a naval command, or an air command. And you do that by writing the command number at the top. So for example, if I wanted to move the R5, the one in R5, which is the 23rd, into the Ukraine here, which is G6, I'd write the 23rd into G6. You write the command at the top and the destination at the bottom. You don't need to write their current location because they are where they are. And if they're moving more than one space, you don't need to indicate the path, only the final destination. If they're traveling by rail all the way across the continent, you just need to say the 58th to R1. Speaking of which, if they are moving by rail, you cannot enter an enemy-controlled, or even if an enemy is present in the territory, with land units. Air units don't affect rail movement. You will have to cancel your order entirely. Otherwise, you can refer to this chart at the top for the movement limits. Naval units move 2 spaces, and land units normally move 1 unless they're traveling by rail, as I mentioned. They can enter the sea, at which they become troop transports. they can move 2 in the sea as long as both movements end at sea. If they're moving onto land, they may only move 1. And then there's also the air units, which can move up to 2 spaces. They will also be able to move 2 more during a special phase, phase 5, in the landing step. So when you move them, you will place one of these landing tags on top of them after they've moved to indicate that they can move 2 more steps in the phase 5. And then finally, there'll be carrier fighters will be able to move. Rather, they'll be able to launch off carriers. And these are special units, unlike others that don't enter stacks. I'll talk more about that later. So on this left side, you'll be writing up to 9 orders. You can only give an order, each command in one order. So if they repeat, you'll follow the first one in if you make a mistake and write it twice, the latter one would get canceled. So you write up to your 9 orders, and then you're also making a bid with oil, which is for turn order. So you'll secretly write a number of oil. It can't be more than you have to bid. And bidding is especially important because you will execute all of your moves before the other player if you choose to move first. On this right side is production, buying new units, which is the last phase of the game. So during this strategic planning phase, you write all your orders and bid for turn orders. Then everybody reveals their bid. Everybody deducts the oil that they spent on their bids, win or lose. If it's tied, you just draw randomly for the winner. And the winner chooses their slot. If they want to go first, let's say the Soviets won, they spent 1 oil where Germany spent none. So the Russians choose to go first, but they could have choose to have gone second. And that is the turn order setup. And then at that point, you'll be moving into phase 3 movement operations. Here is where you will hand your OMP chart to the enemy, and they will read aloud your orders while you are moving the pieces. Germany will call out 57th to G6, and you will then move that order. And if there's any mistake, then it must be canceled or addressed at that time. There is such a thing as pinning in this game. So for example, if there were a certain number of units in the Caucasus and I had orders to leave, I would not be able to leave unless I left a matching force behind. Now, the types don't matter in this case of pinning as far as land goes, but you have to leave an equal number behind. And this is the only time you can split a command during this phase. So to be clear about splitting and merging commands, as I said, any number of commands can exist in a territory, and you can split and merge during most phases, during phase 1, phase 2 before the announcement is made, and in phase 5, 6, and 7. But during movement, you do not write orders to split a command. You have to do that beforehand. And if the only time you can split is if it's forced, in which case you have to leave an equal force and only an equal force, and then the remainder must move on, or the entire amount is canceled. You would take a new command out of your supply, move those on to Ukraine that weren't pinned. Now, air units cannot pin other units, nor can they be pinned, so they do not contribute to the pinning. Naval units do pin. Troop transports have no pinning value, but they may be pinned. During this time, if there's a conflict, say, for example, these guys moved in here, you would place a hotspot immediately. Now, this hotspot reminds you that a combat will need to be resolved during the next step. And this might be done in multiple locations. And then finally, after Soviets have executed all of their orders at once, you don't alternate, you just all of the Soviets' orders, and then the German player will execute all of their movement orders. After all nations have complete, then carrier fighters may launch. Now, carrier fighters are these tokens. these tokens here, and they launch from these green carriers. There's none in this particular scenario. And they can launch up to one space away. So they can launch in the territory where the carrier is. Let's say there was a carrier in A3 with a command, obviously. But it would be able to launch to that territory or even one away. So the land or sea. And those will just disappear and respawn each round, assuming the carrier still survives. So they're not like normal air that go into stacks. Next will be combat operations, phase 4. Now, during this phase, according to turn order, each player will choose a hotspot to resolve. So the Russians will choose to resolve the Ukraine, and in some rare cases it might matter which is resolved first. But these units will be transferred to the battle board, and a battle will be resolved. Like I said, there's another video which goes over the battle steps. And then after the battle, any survivors are returned to the map. If there is a victory, the victor gets a medal, one of these. These will be explained during phase 6 morale. Also, you might put one of these national flag markers. Let's say the Soviets captured the Ukraine, so they would put a flag marker down in the territory to show that they now control it. Also, the card, Germany would have to give up the Ukraine card to the Soviets. So here's the card. They would give the card, and the Soviets would put it in their card holder. And now, during the next round, in phase income, they would start gaining these resources. It could be reclaimed. Also, if the card was captured, Germany would lose or gain 4 stress. After each combat is resolved, you will remove the hotspot, as each combat can only be addressed once. And if it is not fully resolved, meaning there are still surviving units, you flip it over to the embattled side, which again affects income, and the controlling nation will have to flip the card to the striped side to show the reduced income. Okay, so that's it for phase 4. Again, check that other video for the details on conducting combat. Now phase 5, refit and deploy. The first step is landing planes. So all those planes which moved and had landing tags put on them, the red is for Axis, the blue is for Allied forces, now may move 2 more to land in a friendly zone. So they may land in an ally's territory or one of their own controlled, even if it's contested. And all carrier fighter tokens will simply be removed and returned to supply. And a new one will be able to launch the following round for free. After that is done, in turn order for all nations, you will deploy new units. So this won't happen on the first turn, but in subsequent turns, nations will purchase new units, and they will be in stacks of varying types. So even if there were different types, so land units and air units, might all be under this industry token in an industry center. Let's say these were being had been purchased the previous round in Moscow, and now they would deploy. You would take off the industry marker and either merge these with existing commands or create new commands as you like. So there's a few extra commands in your supply. This happens during refit and deploy phase 5. Everybody in turn would deploy their new units that were under production from the previous turn. And then finally, you may reorganize your units. This is a good time to do that as needed. So I could split this into 2 commands. Commands are piece limited, but generally there's a consolidation, so you can move efficiently since you only have 9 orders to write. That's it for phase 5. Phase 6, morale. So this is the phase where you sum up all the casualties that occurred during battle. Units that were eliminated during battle are transferred to the casualty list here. There you can see there's different types. There's the land types, the air, and the sea types. You will be adding up the casualties for each nation in turn. So let's see the Soviets here, and this is their casualty value. You sum that up, and if it reaches, you check this chart here. So if the casualty values totaled, say, 24, you would add another stress to the Soviets. And so each nation adds more stress to the casualty, and then these are returned to the supply finally. And then the next step would be each nation would have the opportunity to eliminate stress points if they had metals. So on a one-to-one basis, you can eliminate one stress for one metal. Or you can purchase civilian goods during production, which effectively do the same thing. One for one, you can eliminate a stress. If that wasn't enough, if you see these numbers here in white, that is the threshold value for each nation. And if you meet or exceed this number, you will move up on the Homeland Status track, which is here. And these are penalties that occur. They're cumulative, and they are increasingly worse, and it drives the end of the game. So if the Soviets were not able to cancel all of their stress, they have 5 here. They would turn this in 5, and then they would move up once on the Homeland Status track. If they had 6, they would just leave any excess in the box. It is possible to move up twice. If they had gained 11 stress this round, they would move up twice on the track and have 1 left over. There is then an opportunity to move back on the stress wheel, but this is very difficult and expensive. You must spend 5 metals or a combination of civilian goods, and you can only move back 1 space per round. But you would turn that in and slide back down. Each nation may do that in turn order. And then finally, the penalties themselves are applied. So let's go over some of these penalties. This first one is labor and civil unrest, where you lose any 3 resources of the player's choice. And they are cumulative, as mentioned. The next one is dysfunctional infrastructure. So your rail becomes completely obsolete. And your port advantage, which is an advanced feature we'll talk about later. Next is supply lines disrupted, and in this case you will lose 3 of your order boxes. So it's essentially you only have 6 orders to write instead of 9 for the Soviets. The Italians only start with 6, so they would only have 3. And then the red one here is economic collapse. That's where you do not count up your resources during phase 1, which is terrible. You would not move up your pegs. You still may keep the pegs you have, but your days are numbered. And then finally, mass desertions, where units start to retreat, and that signals the end of the game, and you may be out. Even though technically the objective of the game is to capture the enemy capital. That is phase 6 morale. And then moving on to phase 7 production. This is where you purchase new units using the right side of the OMP chart over here. And you can see the different types of units to purchase and 5 of any type for the civilian goods here. And they cost different amounts of different combinations of resources. So you can see there are 3 columns for the oil, iron, and OSR. So for example, a new fighter would cost 2 oil, 1 iron, and 1 OSR. So in this case, I wrote down that the Soviets will be purchasing 3 armor. So they multiply how many they're buying times the number of pips here. And then you will tally all that up and deduct it from your resource tracker. This can all be done simultaneously, and it's revealed in turn order. In the global game, you'll be able to trade resources, and there's the exchange chart. But in this two-player scenario, there was no trading. We'll talk more about that in the advanced video. So after you've paid for your new purchases, you will put them out in stacks, but they don't go under commands yet. They still need to be susceptible to strategic bombing, but you'll put them out like this, and in industry sites only. You're limited by the number of smokestacks, which also happens to match the strategic value. So in Volga, there's 2 smokestacks, strategic value 2. You can purchase 2 things there. And you can purchase naval units where you have a port only. So you can see Moscow has 5 smokestacks, so you could produce 5 things there. And those will deploy the following round during the Phase 5, refit and deploy. So after everyone's produced their units and put them out on the board and paid for the cost, you will check for victory based on the scenario conditions. And that's it. You will begin a new round, starting again with your income. So that's a quick run through of the basic rules for War Room. Again, I'll have a second video which covers more advanced topics such as convoy raids and strategic bombing and a Soviet-Japanese pact and neutrals, trading with neutrals, what happens if you invade a neutral.